Greetings, everyone. Rich Martin with AmeriSafe with April's Safety Advisory Call. The topic today will be job hazard analysis, which is the process of identifying what hazards are inherent to the tasks we perform and how we can reduce our employees' exposure to risk and thus reduce the likelihood of injury, illness, or even fatality. So we'll be discussing job hazard analysis, PPE hazard analysis, risk assessment, and going a little bit deeper than just posting safety signs and telling people to be safe. So as a reminder, if you have any safety questions, the FCA safety helpline is available at 844-414-SAFE, or you can send an email to safetyhelpline@finishingcontractors.org. Any questions you ask will be private, confidential. They'll be answered by a safety professional who will be able to provide you the information you need and get you along the path of continual improvement of your safety culture at your organization. This presentation is recorded, and so there will be no interaction, obviously. But if you do have any questions, get a hold of FCA. They'll be able to get a hold of us or contact us directly at those numbers. And if you're looking for a pen and you're trying to find some place to write down these numbers, this slide will be presented again at the end. All right, so let's begin. Job hazards in the workplace. All right. Here's a number of them. When you think of them, these are, the very common ones: slips, trips, and falls from anything from unstable work and walking surfaces, debris left on the floor, slips and puddles of spilled materials, falling off of the edge to a lower level, struck by, things falling off a ladder, things falling from above. One of the reasons why we emphasize so much that even indoors hard hats should be worn at all times. Lacerations are very common injuries in the workplace. Fractures not as common, but they do exist. Crush, caught between injuries are common as well, and we want to reduce exposure to those. Exposure to electrical energy. Many times finishers are working in occupancies that are still under renovation, and there may be multiple tasks going on: drywalling and electric and mechanical. And you are working in an area where you are perhaps finishing something and dangling electrical lines are hanging from the ceiling. And if they are not de-energized and locked out, an accidental activation of that circuit and accidental contact with that circuit could lead to exposure to electrical energy hazards, including electric shock, electrocution, burns, and secondary injuries related to the electrical exposure, such as the shock causing you to fall off your ladder. Noise-induced hearing loss. Most of us who are older understand that we don't hear things the way we did when we were younger. And we took our hearing for granted, not understanding that the hearing loss, noise-induced hearing loss, is cumulative over time. And even moderate levels of noise experienced throughout the entire day can have their toll. So protect your hearing. Eye injuries, things just sticking out, you turn into them. Flying particulate matter, so we're looking at safety glasses, obviously, but also working in such a way that we reduce the risk of potential eye injury exposure as well. Respiratory hazards, we're familiar with dusts and fumes, and we want to protect ourselves from those. Chemical exposures, collapse, things falling on us, repetitive motion or other musculoskeletal disorders are also a risk when you are performing tasks that require a a repetitive motion such as painting with a brush or rolling with a roller. And then environmental hazards exist as well, such as air quality, temperature, and often just hazards that are inherent to the location in which you're working. So what can we do about that? All right. Very often people kind of shrug their shoulders. It's not that they don't care. It's not that they are disinterested. It's just that they don't know what to do, but they know they have a job to do, so they focus on that job and trust in their ability to recognize and react in time to avoid an emergency. Sometimes we have attitudes such as, well, it's the nature of the job. It's the cost of doing business. We know what we're doing. If something happens, we'll deal with it. Hey, if you can't take the heat, get out of the kitchen. And then always the joke environment. You were fired 5 minutes before you got hurt, so don't get hurt. All right. Well, we don't think that that's acceptable. How many in this this audience think that worker injuries are inevitable? Those of us who have worked for any period of time have seen injuries, and we assume, yeah, we do dangerous work. We work in dangerous environments. Things happen, and worker injuries are inevitable. Think about how many workers you know that have been injured. All right, maybe you're even one of them. How many? How many per week? How many per month? How many per day? These are the signs that we need to do something to reduce those risks. All right. How many here think worker injuries are acceptable? We think about that for a moment. We've already accepted that worker injuries are inevitable, and we've developed that recognition or that attitude because we see workers getting injured. Hopefully, they're not serious. Hopefully, it's nothing more than a sprained ankle or a small cut due to a slipping knife or a bruise or a scrape or something like that. But how many here think that worker injuries are acceptable? And if they do, how many injuries are acceptable? 1 per year? 5 per year? We had one client that reported to OSHA that they had 25 recordable incidents. Now this was a precast concrete facility, but 25 worker injuries in a single year that are recordable. That means more than just first aid related injuries, more than just a Band-Aid or an ice pack or washing some dust out of your eye. These are injuries that required medical treatment beyond first aid, such as physical therapy, medications, surgeries, sutures, time off of work. All right, you throw your back out and you have to take a few days off of work. All right, how many of these types of injuries are acceptable? And what level of injury is acceptable? First aid injury is okay. If we can patch it up and get back to work, is that okay? Is that just the cost of doing business? Is that just one of those inevitable worker injuries? Here's the kicker, though. How do you feel about you being the injured worker? Many of us will often not take serious things serious until it affects them. And it's not being selfish. It's just that you've got things to do. You've got your life to live, and life goes on. But when it's you, all of a sudden, it becomes very important. So let's ask some, I don't know, detached questions, I guess you could call them. How much are you worth? What's the first thought that popped into your head? How much are you worth? If we were to break down your body into its chemical components, the calcium, the potassium, the sodium, all of the different chemicals that make up your body, experts have estimated that it would be worth about $160.05. All right. International Standard Insurance Organization values the average worker at approximately $50,000. Most of you are thinking, yeah, I'm worth a lot more than $50,000. So let's go on. Your employer value, let's say they keep you for 40 years and you're loyal to the company and you like working for them and you choose to work for them for 40 years and they pay you on average, the national average of $63,000 for 40 years. Comes out to $2.5 million or more. Does that make you a millionaire? Well, you've certainly had more than $1 million over those 40 years, right? But at any rate, your value to your employer is at least that much based on the investment they put into you by hiring you, by training you, by providing you with the equipment you need, by watching over you and keeping you safe. And so that now we're starting to get into sizable money. Your component value, if you were to be broken down into your component parts, and we're going to sell off your liver, and we're going to sell off your lungs, and we're going to sell off your heart, and all of the different donatable components that make up your human body, can be as valuable as $45 million, depending on how that gets broken down and distributed. As I said in the beginning, these are some detached values, but you have some value. What's your family value you at? All right. As far as your family is concerned, you're priceless. All right. You provide an income to your family. You provide support to your kids. You provide companionship to your family and to your wife. It's a lifetime commitment. All right. And if you were to ask any of your family members, typically, they would say that your value to them is priceless, and they would not give you up for any of these amounts of money if they could avoid it. All right, so if we get back to this picture here and we slip up to the next concept here, what do we do about these hazards in the workplace? Do we prepare for them? And if so, how do we prepare for them? Again, these attitudes. We'll adapt and overcome. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. We will, figure it out when the time comes. I don't have the time right now to adapt. I don't have the time to plan. I don't have the time to prepare to avoid these hazards. Plus, I hate paperwork. All right. This sounds like paperwork. And yes, there can be some paperwork involved. But how do we prepare? We're going to do job hazard analysis, which is a process. So this is what OSHA says about employer responsibility relating to protecting workers from unsafe environments. It said the failure to identify or recognize present or potential hazards is one of the root causes of workplace injuries, illnesses, and incidents. And if you remember the general duty clause from OSHA, employers have the responsibility to protect their workers from unsafe work environments and to provide them a safe and healthful workplace. It's that old you knew or you should have known concept when protecting your workers from those exposures. So the process involves collecting existing information about the workplace hazards. If you work in a static environment, those hazards don't change very much. And generally, once you've corrected the hazard, it's corrected forever, as long as it is maintained. Construction workers don't have that luxury, however, because every workplace is different. The workplace is dynamic and constantly changing. The hazards that were present on Monday may no longer exist by Thursday, but by Thursday, there may be other hazards that are presented. So we need to do continual inspection of the workplace for safety hazards. This is something that should be done on a daily basis by the responsible person and by all employees as well, who have a responsibility to, when they recognize a safety hazard, inform their supervisors so that they can come up with a plan to eliminate that hazard. Third-party inspections are also very useful because, number one, you can have a person who can focus specifically on that without interrupting production. But number two, you have a fresh set of eyes that can see things that perhaps you have become inured to and no longer recognize as being a hazard. We need to not only identify the safety hazards that are there, but health hazards as well, which mostly involves things like exposures to chemicals. Recently, of course, with COVID, there's a health hazard there that we had to mitigate and we had to work through. So we understand that. We have to conduct incident investigations. That's a whole nother topic, but incident investigations typically involve trying to figure out what the person did wrong and then determining how you're going to punish them or whether or not you're going to keep them and retrain them or fire them, which is not the purpose of incident investigations. The purpose of incident investigations, of course, is to identify what the causes of the incident were so that we can correct the hazards and exposures that led up to the incident, eliminate them so that we can prevent an incident from happening again down the road. We need to identify hazards associated with emergency and non-routine situations. So generally, if we do something frequently and we do something regularly, we have habit patterns that have built in that usually automatically have safety protocols built in. But when you're doing a task that you don't typically do, perhaps you haven't done it for 3 or 4 months and you're trying to relearn a tool or trying to remember the best way to perform a task. Those are the times when distraction sets in and people start exposing themselves to risks that they would not normally experience in a routine task. And we need to characterize the nature of the identified hazards, identify interim control measures, and then prioritize the hazards for control. So, what is the nature of the identified hazards? What is the hazard? Is it a struck by hazard? Is it a caught between hazard? Is it a slip and fall hazard? Identify those interim control measures. What are we going to do to reduce exposure to those hazards we've identified? And then we're going to prioritize those hazards and say, this is what we need to correct first and immediately, and perhaps those others we can deal with down the road. So if you are working in an environment where your control is limited to the tasks that you are required to perform, you have to interface with the general contractor. Very often, a finisher may have some work conflict with an electrician or with a carpenter and may not recognize the fact that the carpenter is doing work that is hazardous to you. But they are not looking out for you, they're looking out for themselves. So when you see those kinds of activities, make sure you talk to the general contractor, talk to other subcontractors to find out what kind of work they're doing that could affect you. This is unrelated to finishing work, but not too long ago, we had some bricklayers working on the exterior of a building, putting up brick. And they're probably about 40 foot high up on a ladder climbing scaffold, and about another 20, 30 feet above them on the roof, a roofing crew is unstrapping a bundle of lumber that they're going to use on the roof. As they unstrapped the bundle of lumber, some of the lumber broke free from the bundle, fell over the edge of the roof about 20 feet, and a 10-foot 2x8 struck one of the brick guys right in the back, knocked him out cold. As a matter of fact, they thought that he was going to have a permanent back injury. He's an older gentleman. Took a little while for him to recover. The older you get, the longer it takes you to recover, but he is back on the job and he's fine. He was sore for a while. But here we have an example of 2 different work activities going on by 2 different groups. The roofers up above either didn't know that the brick guys were down below or didn't recognize that what they were doing might be a hazard to the brick guys. The brick guys down below state they had no idea there was any roofing activity going up above where they were. So when we talk about talking to other subcontractors and general contractors, it is always a good idea to coordinate with each other and maybe time activities so that in that case, for example, the roof workers could have coordinated with the brick workers and say, we're going to be doing some work right above you. When would be a good time for us to do that? So that we're not doing it when you're on your scaffold, or should we do it another day? What can we do to protect anything from falling over onto the workers? But those are plans that should have been addressed beforehand. At the beginning of the day or at the beginning of the job, perform an initial and frequent periodic inspection to identify any hazards, including those which may have developed since the last inspection. And don't just look at those physical safety hazards such as slip, trip, and fall hazards. All right. Look also at health hazards, including hazardous atmospheres, dust and silica exposure, laser light activity going on in the area, lead abatement, asbestos abatement. Keep an eye out for all of that. If an incident does occur, conduct a thorough incident investigation. Identify the root causes and identify proper corrective measures to prevent that incident from happening again. The focus is not to place blame, but to prevent the incident from reoccurring. Make sure you know your location's emergency action plan for high-risk tasks, such as working at heights or how you're going to react in the event of a weather or a natural or a man-caused disaster or any other unusual activity going on in the area. All right, so what is job hazard analysis? It's more than just recognizing that the workplace is hazardous. That's a given. It's more than just posting signs and requiring PPE. Almost any job you go into, often at the gate and often posted frequently throughout the structure, will be signs saying safety first, let's all go home safe, hard hat area, wear your safety glasses. Unfortunately, many times people post signs like that and then assume that our safety requirements are met. We've passed it off to the guys and they should know to work safely. Telling everyone to be safe, by the way, is not a safety briefing. All right. So we want to make sure that we are eliminating hazards as much as we can, rather than defaulting to the everybody wear your PPE and be safe. Our purpose is to protect workers from exposure to the incident in the first place. Remember that PPE protects you from something that happens to you. The purpose of job hazard analysis is to prevent that from happening in the first place. Preventing injuries, preventing incidents. We try not to use the term accidents because we believe that, except for very rare exceptions, every injury was an incident that could have been planned for and prevented from even happening in the first place. So once you've established your job hazard analysis, you've done your job hazard analysis, you've identified the risks and what you're going to do about them, then we develop policies and procedures for present and future applications. Why do we do this? Because we don't want to rehash the same lessons over and over. Why reinvent the wheel? If we have come up with a safe method of performing a task, we develop a policy and a procedure and we pass it on to everybody, thus reducing the risk of exposure across the board. To identify how we are going to protect workers from hazards, there is something called the hierarchy of controls. It's an inverted pyramid, I guess, or an inverted triangle. But you have the most effective measures to the least effective measures. Note that the most effective measure is an elimination of the hazard in the first place. I have a client that has storage boxes, Connex boxes on trailers. But because of the configuration of the doors, the trailers are more than 4 feet off the ground in general industry. You have to have fall protection at 4 feet or more, which means stairways with handrails, guardrails, but because of the doors, they can't do that. So in order to protect themselves from the fall, A logical and simple solution is to remove the Connex box from the trailer, place it on a concrete or an asphalt pad on the ground. All right, we're talking about a permanent installation here. And we have eliminated the hazard. Nobody is going to fall from this trailer anymore. Substitution, we replace the hazard. An example is, I think it was Safety Clean, an environmental cleanup company. They used to use a cleaner that had some toxic properties to it, and people were getting sick. Well, they actually developed a chemical that would do the same task just as effectively, but not have that toxic component to it. So by substituting the one chemical for another, they've replaced the hazard and reduced the exposure to their employees. Engineering controls are what we use to isolate people from the hazard. A guard on a grinder, for example, is an engineering control. A guardrail at a fall height is an engineering control. Administrative controls, it's changing the way people work. Generally, this is policies and procedures. But the problem with policies and procedures, as you can see, we go down this pyramid, we are introducing more and more of the human element. Engineering controls requires people to use the engineering controls, right? Stay behind the guardrails. Don't take the guard off the grinder. Administrative controls, policies and procedures, well, people often don't follow policies and procedures. And as a result, they end up getting injured. Finally, we get down to PPE, protect the worker with PPE. PPE is a measure of last resort, and it is used to protect workers from anything that the previous methods did not protect the worker from. So those very rare but unforeseen, who'd have thunk type situations that end up coming up. But the effort should always be to use this hierarchy of controls to eliminate the hazard from even being, the worker from even being exposed to the hazard. So what is job hazard analysis? There are 3 questions to ask. What is the task? What are the hazards related to performing that task? And what are the corrective measures that we're going to implement to protect the workers from those hazards? The more hazardous or the more complex the task, the more developed the JHA needs to be. And how do we know how hazardous a task is going to be? All right, we know through knowledge, experience, and analysis. Remember, knowledge and experience is only as good as the person's knowledge and experience. And we know many workers that have 20 years on the job, but every day is like their first day. We also know many people that it's their first day on the job and they run around thinking that like they have 20 years of experience. So you can see where knowledge and experience do have some limitations. And that's where analysis comes in to get everybody on the same page and make sure that all contingencies are thought of. One of the ways that can be used, one of the methods that can be used to identify how hazardous a task is going to be is something called a risk matrix. This is just an example of a risk matrix. There are many risk matrices out there. Most of them follow a format similar to this. But when we try to identify what the risk is in a task, we generally look at the impact and the likelihood of an injury or an incident happening in the performance of this task. So we break them down from very low to very high impact and rare to very likely likelihood. The more likely it is to happen and the greater impact it will have if it does happen, the greater the risk is going to be. So if we look along the matrix here, very low, there won't be any injuries, or if there are any injuries, it's probably just be first aid, environmental damage, less than $1,000, no big deal, all the way up to very high. Major injuries are possible, amputations, disability, disfigurement, or even potentially fatality. And there may be toxic environmental damage. The damage we do may cause great deals of financial cost. And as we look at likelihood, rare, could occur under exceptional circumstances. Yeah, it's possible. The chances are never zero, but very unlikely to occur. Up to very likely, expected under normal circumstances. We know that in the performance of this task, if you aren't very careful, something very bad could happen. And we assign these risks here a score. Just to review, low impact plus rare likelihood is low risk. All right, as the impact or the likelihood increases, the risk increases. And as the risk increases, the more important it is to identify the hazards and implement controls. So when we look at that score, we've identified, at least on this risk matrix, that a score of greater than 19 or 20 or higher has critical risk. A score of 10 to 19 is a high risk, 4 to 9 moderate risk, and less than 4 low risk. So it looks like this. We have little values there for each impact and likelihood. So rare has a value of 1, and impact very low has a value of 1. And very high is 5 and very likely is 5. So if we multiply those values out, 1 times 1 is 1, 2 times 2 is 4, right? And you can see on that matrix, as we move from the low left to the upper right, the risk score increases correspondingly. And we can see here that a score of 1 to 3 is a low risk incident. A score of 4 to 10 is 4 to 9 is moderate risk, and from 10 to 19 high risk, and then from 20 up is critical risk. If we color chart that like this, we can see that as we evaluate our task and we say this task has a possible likelihood of something happening, and let's say a medium risk, medium impact, medical services are probably going to be likely. So if our likelihood is possible and our impact is medium, 3 times 3 is 9. We look right there at the crossover point between the two, and we can see that there is moderate risk there. And we're in the yellow range. As we go higher, we get orange and then red, of course. But this is what a risk matrix looks like as you evaluate your task for the likelihood of anything happening and the impact. This is a tool that can be used. So let's look at an example. Simple task, right? Try and keep it simple and apply to everybody. Our task description is going to be a simple mopping of the floor. What are the potential hazards when mopping of the floor? Well, the best person to ask is the person who mops the floor. When you mop the floor, what kind of hazards do you face? Well, the floor gets slippery and, I can slip, I can fall, I can trip over the mop bucket, I can trip over things that are on the floor. There's chemical exposure depending on what kind of chemicals I'm using in the mop water. And then there's, of course, repetitive motion injury from moving that mop handle back and forth all the time. So what are our recommendations going to be? Well, we'll post signs. We'll put the wet floor sign out on the floor that says slippery when wet, be careful, don't enter this area, floor mopping going on, whatever form it takes. The person mopping the floor should make sure they're wearing footwear with slip-resistant soles. They're wearing protective eyewear to protect themselves from any water splash or chemical splash. Take frequent breaks to avoid repetitive motion injuries. Maybe switch up the way you're holding the mop handle. Stretch frequently used muscles and maintain good posture. So what does that JHA look like? In our safety and health manual, we have in our job hazard analysis program, we have a job hazard analysis form, which is up on the screen there for you now. And you can see here, task description, location, area, and we're worried about those 3 things. First, we need to, of course, a step. The task ID is the step. So mopping the floor, step 1 would be what? Fill up your mop bucket, perhaps. And there you would put task description. What are the hazards related to that task? What are the recommended actions that we're going to do to protect ourselves? So we want to know what step we're in. what the description is of the step, what the hazards are related to doing that, and what we're going to do to protect workers from that exposure. So we'll get started here. Job hazard analysis, mopping the floor at 123 Main Street, Anytown, in the administrative offices. All right. Under personal protective equipment, we've identified what personal protective equipment will be needed in order to do this task right up in front. So anybody reviewing this can look at it and say, okay, I know what I need to get. And we'll talk a little bit at the end about the PPE hazard analysis. Step one, prepare the mop solution, right? What are our hazards in preparing the mop solution? Well, we have slip and fall hazards. So what are we going to do? We're going to wear footwear with slip-resistant soles. We're going to post warning signs to inform workers in the area. We're going to keep wet areas small and manageable and dry the floor as much as possible by wringing out the mop frequently. We have chemical exposure to the eyes and the skin. Wear protective eyewear. Wash hands frequently. All right. So we are preparing the area to mop the area by posting those signs and making sure that we have an understanding of the process. And we are protecting ourselves from the potential for chemical exposure to the skin and eyes. So what's step two? Mop the floor. What are our hazards? Slip and fall. So again, we're going to wear that footwear. We're going to post those warning signs, and we are going to be consistent. So these can be repetitive. And the reason we bring it up here is that the riskier the task, the more detailed these JHAs need to be. All right. So we have a repetitive motion injury in mopping the floor. So we'll take frequent breaks. We'll use proper body mechanics. If we had more room, we could put things in like, I don't know, change position of the way you're holding the mop handle and so on. All right. We have our job hazard analysis there. And once it's been done and it's approved, the signature, the job hazard analysis, whoever did it will sign off on it. It'll be reviewed by a responsible person, typically the supervisor or administration. And then they'll sign off on that and make this an official document. Then we don't just stick these in a drawer and file them, right? We use these as a training document. We can use a JHA to develop a procedure and a guideline on how to perform a task. So we are not just going through the motions here to create a document that OSHA expects you to have. No, this is intended to be a useful document. PPE hazard analysis is similar. All right. So PPE hazard analysis, by the way, is a requirement by OSHA. Job hazard analysis is an expectation from OSHA, and it's certainly something they'll be looking for if they perform an investigation or they audit your work site. But the standard does not specifically require a structured job hazard analysis beyond that. You are expected to identify the work hazards inherent to your workplace and protect your workers from them. PPE hazard analysis, however, is a requirement by OSHA. So the three questions you need to ask with PPE hazard analysis: what type of protection are we considering? What hazards are present? And what PPE will be required? The more hazardous the task or the more complex the task is, the more important it is that you do a good, legitimate PPE hazard analysis. And remember, you can have a basic form of PPE required on any job site. In most construction sites, your typical expected PPE will be protective footwear, hard hat, safety glasses, and high-vis shirt or high-vis vest if you're working in an area with traffic or with moving equipment. Of course, in the performance of your tasks, there may be additional task-specific PPE required as well. So here's what OSHA 29 CFR 1910.132 for general industry requires. The employer must conduct a hazard analysis to identify hazards for which PPE will be needed. 1910 standard is much more stringent than the 1926 standard. However, very often construction guys will push back and say that's the 1910 standard. we operate under the 1926 standard. Keep in mind, however, that if there is no specific standard for a specific task in your discipline, OSHA can and does cite based on other established standards. So OSHA does cite construction for not performing JHAs and PPE hazard analyses under the general duty clause. And then they apply the 1910 standard. That's that pesky, you knew or should have known that this is something that you should have done to protect your workers. And oh, by the way, look, it's actually spelled out here in 1910, and this is what we expect. Between October 2021 and September of 2022, OSHA issued construction companies 23 citations over 19 inspections for PPE violations, 17 for under the 1910.132 standard, and 2 under the 1926.95 standard. I'm sorry, 1926.95 standard. So OSHA does cite, even though the 1926 standard is less specific. So when we look at the type of protection we're looking at, we need to protect the body, right? Head, eyes and face, hearing, body, arms, hands, legs, feet. All right. We could go on, torso, health, respiratory system, internal organs, all of these. We also need to protect from hazardous environments, such as fall protection, respiratory protection, radiation, ionizing and non-ionizing radiation, and then other hazards. For example, there are requirements for signage when doing lead work or asbestos work, signage that is required to put up when laser levels are being used, and silica dust hazard is ongoing as well. So these are just some, not all, some of the things that OSHA expects you to evaluate for and identify the appropriate PPE to protect the workers. So the PPE hazard analysis is similar to the JHA analysis system. All right. Again, we have 3 things we're worrying about. And in our program, in our personal protective equipment program, we do have this assessment form that assists in identifying what kind of PPE you may need. So we need to worry about the type of protection we're looking at. We want to protect against falls. We want to protect against head injury. We want to protect the eyes and face. What hazards may they be exposed to in the workplace? We try to identify the most common and the most likely, but we can't predict everything until list is to exclude. So we also provide spaces for you to write in hazards that maybe are not listed. And then what kind of personal protective equipment is necessary. So if we look here, for example, head, what is our hazard? Our hazard is potentially falling overhead objects. Well, if it is, then you check it. Swinging and or moving objects, stationary objects that present a bump hazard, and then we can look at the personal protective equipment. What type of head protection are we going to require? Just as with the JHA system, it gets reviewed. Right there on the JHA, you'll update with the PPE that you need to use, and then sign off on it and make this an approved document. And as always, these documents are intended to be useful and functional documents. They can be used as toolbox talks, safety briefings, planning during your planning when you're bidding out the job, training topics for periodic training and safety stand downs, and also the development of policies and procedures. Make sure you review the JHA with all workers affected. It does them no good if you do a job hazard analysis and you identify what hazards they face and what you're going to do to protect them from those hazards if you don't pass that information on to your workers. Make sure you provide the required PPE and don't depend just on your employees letting you know when they need new PPE. Many of them don't pay attention to it, and they'll let you know when they need PPE only after it's completely failed. And now how do they work without PPE? So go around and do your own inspections of PPE and make sure that they're using safety glasses and not sunglasses. Make sure their hard hats are in good shape and that they're being worn properly. Watch out for those stickers, by the way, too. OSHA does cite hard hats having stickers too close to the brim. I believe it's 3/4 for 3/4 of an inch, but to be safe, make sure that there are no stickers within 1 inch of the brim. OSHA will cite for that. And so inspect and then enforce the use of PPE. If you see somebody not wearing that PPE, make sure that you stand up and you follow through. And by the way, making people understand that they're wearing the PPE to protect themselves rather than to comply with a checklist will be much more effective. For example, yelling at somebody for not wearing a hard hat is much less effective than just tapping your head, pointing at the guy and just saying, hey, protect your head, or tapping those glasses, hey, protect your eyes. Often I see people wearing a high-vis vest over a high-vis shirt. And I'm looking at the high-vis shirt, which is shiny and new and bright yellow or bright orange. And I'm looking at their high-vis vest, which is all raggedy and dingy because it's never seen the inside of a washing machine and it's sun-faded and it should have been replaced 2 years ago. And I just kind of shake my head because by checking off that box, the boss says I must wear a high-vis vest. They've actually reduced their high visibility by putting it on over a bright high-vis t-shirt. So, as I said before, if you have any questions, if you have any concerns, or if you have any information you'd like to provide to help us improve our presentations and our services, we would love to hear from you. The FCA safety line is 844-414-SAFE, or you can email at safetyhelpline@finishingcontractors.org. Please don't hesitate to ask if you have any questions, and we would love to help you out. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.